Welcome to Truth Behind History. The stories are real, the impact is lasting. Today, we're diving into a powerful and often overlooked question. What happens when money just stops working? Not because someone stole it, not because it vanished in a market crash, but because people stop believing in it altogether. Now, that might sound like economic science fiction, but it has happened multiple times, across different countries, cultures, and eras. Let's begin by looking at three distinct moments in history where the traditional idea of money, something we trust, use, and rely on every day, collapsed under pressure. And when it did, people had to get creative just to survive. First, Weimar Germany, between 1921 and 1923. This was the land of post-war despair, crushed by World War I reparations and printing money like there was no tomorrow. And, well, there wasn't, for their currency. Inflation turned to hyperinflation. Prices doubled by the day. Savings? Wiped out. People carried wheelbarrows of cash just to buy bread. Imagine that, your entire life savings can't get you a cup of coffee by lunchtime. A loaf of bread could cost 1 billion marks by evening. It was economic madness. Then we have Soviet Russia during the Civil War years of 1917 to 1922. The state tried to command the economy into obedience, but chaos doesn't listen. The ruble was worth less than the paper it was printed on. The state-run economy collapsed under the weight of war and central planning. People turned to something older than any currency, barter, trading flour for firewood, boots for bullets. Informal networks replaced formal institutions almost overnight. And then, fast forward to the early 2000s in Argentina. A different continent, a different time, but the same core breakdown. The government froze bank accounts during what became known as the Corralito. Citizens couldn't access their own money, and confidence in the peso plummeted. But here's the twist. People didn't wait around for a solution. They created their own. Barter clubs called Clubs de Truque popped up across the country. It wasn't sanctioned, it wasn't planned, but it worked. In all three cases, Germany, Russia, Argentina, we see the same haunting pattern. When centralized monetary systems fail, people don't just give up. They adapt. They build new systems of exchange. Sometimes crude, sometimes brilliant, but always human. And that brings us to a deeper question. What exactly happens when money loses trust? What are the mechanics behind the collapse? Let's find out on the next slide. So, let's break this down. What actually happens when people no longer trust their money? We tend to think of money as just paper or numbers on a screen. But really, money is a social contract, a belief, an agreement that this thing, whatever it is, has value, because we all agree it does. But once that trust is broken, the collapse isn't just financial, it's psychological, and it's fast. First, hyperinflation destroys value. This isn't just a rise in prices, it's a full-blown confidence crisis. Imagine working for a paycheck, and by the time you get to the store, that paycheck buys half of what it did the day before. People stop thinking of money as a store of value and start treating it like a hot potato. The goal becomes to get rid of it as fast as possible, to buy something, anything, before the currency loses even more value. That's why people begin hoarding tangible goods, food, firewood, fuel, gold, anything real. Next, price signals disappear. This might sound boring, but it's actually catastrophic. In a healthy economy, prices communicate information. They tell you what's scarce, what's in demand, where to invest, what to conserve. But during a collapse, prices go haywire, or vanish altogether. You walk into a store, and there isn't a price, or the price changes by the hour. How do you know what anything is worth when there's no reference point? You don't. So trade doesn't just slow down, it moves into the shadows. Markets go underground. Finally, trust shifts to peer networks. This is where things get interesting. When governments, banks, or currencies fail, people don't stop trading. They just stop using the old tools. They rely on neighbors, friends, local networks. Trust becomes personal, not institutional. It's no longer about what's legal, it's about what works. You can think of this like an economic immune system. When the body of formal finance gets infected, society doesn't die, it improvises. And that brings us to one of the most extreme examples of that improvisation, Weimar Germany, 1923. Let's go there next. Weimar Germany in 1923. If economic chaos had a poster child, this would be it. By this point, inflation had become hyperinflation on steroids. The German mark was losing value so quickly, people were literally burning it for heat because it was cheaper than firewood. No joke. Now, picture this, you're a parent in Berlin. Your salary gets paid daily, and you rush to the bakery before prices double again. But eventually, even that doesn't work. The baker stops taking cash altogether. Why? Because by the time they can spend it, it's worthless. So what happens? Barter saves the day. Local, spontaneous exchanges became the only way families could survive. Bread for coal, clothing for potatoes, soap for shoes. There were no fixed rules, just mutual need. You had something I needed, I had something you needed. That was enough. But it didn't stop there. Tangible assets began to replace currency altogether. Gold coins, silverware, foreign banknotes, even food became more trusted than paper marks. And if you were lucky enough to have Swiss francs or US dollars, you were golden, literally, because those still held value. Now, how did the state respond to all this? Well, not well. Authorities imposed price controls, tried rationing goods, and declared certain trades illegal. The idea was to stabilize things, but these actions often made things worse. Instead of calming markets, they pushed more trade into the black market. When prices are frozen but needs are real, people will always find a way to trade, just not in ways the government can monitor or tax. It's a classic case of good intentions clashing with desperate realities. The more the state tried to control the economy, the more chaotic it became. But Germany wasn't alone in this. In fact, the same breakdown, followed by the same improvised resilience, played out in a very different place, under a very different system, Soviet Russia. Let's head there next. Now we move to Soviet Russia, right in the middle of a civil war, famine, and revolutionary upheaval. The years were 1917 to 1922, and the official plan was simple: to abolish markets, nationalize everything, and let the state provide. But here's the problem with planned economies: reality doesn't follow blueprints. As the Bolsheviks seized control and tried to centralize production, the ruble collapsed. On paper, the government ran the economy. In practice, the streets belonged to the bag men. Let's start with the countryside. Farmers, often called peasants at the time, were expected to hand over their grain to the state at fixed prices. But why would they? The rubles they were offered had no value. You couldn't eat them. You couldn't trade them. So peasants started hoarding their grain, refusing to sell unless they received tangible goods in return. They didn't trust the money. They trusted flour, tools, boots, things that mattered. Meanwhile, in the cities, people were desperate. So what did they do? They packed bags full of factory-made goods, shoes, soap, pots, nails, and headed to the countryside to trade with farmers. These urban traders were nicknamed bag men. You could see them traveling on foot or by train, carrying massive sacks over their shoulders, hoping to swap whatever goods they had for food to bring back and survive. And while all of this was technically illegal, it worked. In fact, it worked so well that the black market began to outpace the official economy. Despite repression, despite propaganda, and despite the risk of arrest, people traded. Because they had to. Here's the kicker: the informal economy, built on relationships, trust, and necessity, was meeting basic needs more efficiently than the bureaucratic, centrally planned one. Even as the government tried to tighten its grip, the people were quietly building a parallel system beneath the surface. This wasn't rebellion. This was survival. And now, let's travel forward in time to a different crisis: Argentina in the early 2000s, where, once again, people rebuilt trust from the ground up when the formal economy failed. On to the next slide. Now we arrive in Argentina, early 2000s, and this time, the collapse wasn't sparked by war or revolution. It was something almost more chilling: a quiet, grinding financial failure that left ordinary people frozen out of their own money. The crisis hit hard when the government imposed the Corralito, a banking freeze that locked citizens out of their savings accounts. Imagine waking up one morning, walking to your bank, and being told, "You can't have your money. Not today, not tomorrow. We don't know when." The peso collapsed. Trust collapsed with it. But here's the beautiful part: Argentinians didn't wait for politicians or economists to rescue them. They saved themselves. Across the country, ordinary people came together to form barter markets called clubs de truque. These were not tiny, backyard swaps. These were massive, organized community centers where thousands of people gathered to trade everything from fresh vegetables to household repairs to medical services, without using a single peso. And they didn't just barter, they innovated. Communities created their own form of money, local credits or scrips, issued and accepted within their barter networks. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't perfect, but it was functional. It restored the ability to trade, to cooperate, to rebuild life. And what's truly fascinating, these networks thrived without any formal support from the government. No central oversight, no bailouts, just people helping people. Voluntary, decentralized, resilient. In fact, at its peak, it's estimated that millions of Argentinians were involved in some form of barter club activity. That's not a niche alternative, that's society reweaving itself from the bottom up. What Argentina showed the world is something profound: when formal systems collapse, informal systems don't just replace them, they often improve on them. They're faster, more flexible, and grounded in real human needs rather than distant policy decisions. And this pattern, this spontaneous rebuilding of economic life, isn't just a one-off miracle. It's a recurring lesson about human nature itself. Let's dig deeper into that pattern on the next slide. So what do all these stories, from Germany to Russia to Argentina, actually tell us? At first glance, they might seem like isolated crises, separated by oceans and decades. But look a little closer, and you'll notice something extraordinary, a hidden pattern about who we are when systems collapse. First, exchange is intrinsic to survival. It's not something governments invent. It's not something economists design. It's something we do naturally. Strip away money, banks, and official markets, and people still find a way to trade, to cooperate, to meet each other's needs. It's as natural as breathing. Trade is human nature in motion. Second, voluntary networks form naturally. When centralized structures break down, people don't wait for new orders from the top. They build from the bottom. Friend to friend, neighbor to neighbor. These peer-to-peer systems don't need elaborate hierarchies. They're based on trust, reputation, and mutual benefit. Principles that are far older and more reliable than any government decree. And third, creativity outpaces central planning. Always, every single time. The beauty and the unpredictability of human problem-solving is that it moves faster than any bureaucracy ever could. When the peso died, clubs de truque appeared overnight. When the mark crumbled, Germans traded bread for coal without waiting for permission. When Soviet factories collapsed, bagmen created unofficial trade routes across a starving empire. No economist, no central committee, no 5-year plan could have predicted or managed these spontaneous eruptions of ingenuity. And here's the quiet truth that history whispers to us: people don't need to be ordered to survive. They need to be allowed to adapt. When control tightens, creativity thrives underground. When systems freeze, life flows around them. Which brings us to the final piece of this story, the big picture reflections. What moral and economic lessons should we take away from these historical collapses? Let's bring it all together on the next and final slide. Throughout history, when money has broken down and governments have faltered, one truth stands out like a lighthouse in the storm. Voluntary markets are not luxuries, they are human necessities. Every time an official system collapses, people instinctively build parallel systems, rooted in trust, exchange, and cooperation. Not because someone told them to, not because they read a manual, but because survival demands it. Trade is hardwired into who we are. Meanwhile, coercive systems, those based on force, control, and rigid authority, consistently fail when put under pressure. They can issue decrees, they can print money, they can set prices, but they cannot override human nature. When incentives break, when trust dissolves, top-down systems collapse into irrelevance, while bottom-up ingenuity keeps societies alive. And here's perhaps the most powerful takeaway of all: resilience lies not in centralization, but in decentralization. It's in the ability of individuals and small communities to adapt, to create, to exchange freely without waiting for permission. That's the real engine of survival, and often of rebirth after collapse. These are not just economic lessons, they are moral ones. They remind us that freedom, trust, and voluntary cooperation are not optional features of civilization. They are the foundation, and when that foundation is honored, societies thrive. When it's ignored, history speaks, and it speaks loudly. Thank you for joining us on this journey through collapses, creativity, and the stubborn brilliance of the human spirit. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the hidden patterns of history, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Truth Behind History. We have many more true stories to uncover, stories that challenge assumptions, reveal forgotten truths, and show how the past still shapes the present. Check out our other videos for more history with depth, with honesty, and with heart. Until next time, stay curious.